One of the hallmarks of democratic opposition is that political disputes are settled at the ballot box and in Parliament rather than by violence. But on the afternoon of Sunday the 27th of May 1798, that peaceful convention was shattered by the sound of gunfire as a leading opposition MP drew a pistol, took aim at the Prime Minister and fired. I'm Dr. Nigel Fletcher. I'm a political historian and the author of a new book called The Not Quite Prime Ministers, telling the stories of all the many people who served as leader of the opposition but failed to make it to 10 Downing Street. And today's leader of the opposition is a man called George Tierney, who became leader of the Whig Party in the House of Commons in the autumn of 1818. And it was he who'd pulled the trigger on that fateful afternoon 20 years before. And given that I described in the last video how another Prime Minister had been assassinated, this is becoming something of a running theme. But more of that later. Behind me here, in St James's, is Brooks Club on St James's Street in London, which in the early part of the 19th century was the epicentre of the Whig Party's political operation. And after the sudden death of George Ponsonby in 1817, the Whigs spent a year without a replacement leader in the House of Commons, with Earl Grey serving as overall leader from the House of Lords. Then, after the general election of 1818, a group of Whig MPs met here at Brooks and agreed that the situation could not continue as it was. A total of 113 of them signed a letter to George Tierney pledging their support and urging him to accept the leadership of the party in the House of Commons. Nowadays, we've become quite familiar with the process of backbench MPs signing letters calling on their leaders to resign, so it's quite a novelty to find an example where they use this process to ask somebody instead to become the leader. So, what was his backstory? Well, just like last week's leader, Tierney was of Irish ancestry, but unlike him, he was not from an aristocratic family. His father was a wealthy merchant from Limerick, but was working in Gibraltar at the time of George's birth, and it was there that the future politician was born. He grew up in England, attended Eton and Cambridge, and initially became a lawyer before entering politics. His road to the House of Commons was not quite straightforward. He lost his first election in Wootton Bassett in 1784. Then at the second attempt in Colchester 4 years later, he polled the same number of votes as his opponent and was only awarded the seat by an election committee. He then lost that seat the following year and failed to be elected when he stood in Southwark in 1796. He appealed that result, had it declared void, and then lost the ensuing by-election. It took another election petition for him finally to be awarded the seat. As I say, there have been easier ways to get elected. But once in the House of Commons, he became a prominent Whig radical and a close ally of Charles Grey in opposition to the government of William Pitt. He strongly supported parliamentary reform and was a vocal supporter of the French Revolution, a stance that saw him portrayed in cartoons as a French executioner. His fiery attacks on the government led to the most dramatic incident of his career, which I mentioned at the start of this video. During a debate in May 1798, the Prime Minister, William Pitt, accused him of lacking patriotism for failing to support the government's defence policy. Tierney was outraged by the attack on his honour and demanded that Pitt withdraw the allegation. When he refused, the opposition MP took matters into his own hands and challenged the Prime Minister to a duel with pistols. And so it was that on the fateful day, Sunday the 27th of May, Pitt the Younger, the King's First Minister, met his opponent on Putney Heath for an armed shootout. Jokes were made at the time that it was something of an unfair contest, given that Pitt was significantly thinner and presented a smaller target. But the danger was no laughing matter. Many of those present tried to persuade the Prime Minister not to go through with it, but he was determined. He and Tierney marched 12 paces, faced each other, and fired their pistols at one another. Both of them missed. Whether deliberately or not, we can't be sure, but in any case, colleagues of both men intervened again to beg them not to carry on. This time, they relented. The duel was declared over, with honour having apparently been satisfied. Whilst thankfully no harm was done, it's extraordinary to think of a Prime Minister putting his life in danger in this way. And even at the time, it caused a major controversy. with the Times newspaper declaring that the public would share their concern that a life as valuable as Pitt's should have been risked when the country was at war and the fate of Europe hung in the balance. As for Tierney, a few years later he accepted office briefly under Henry Addington as Treasurer of the Navy, and again in the so-called Ministry of All the Talents as President of the Board of Control. But when that government fell, he was again in opposition, and remained so for the next 20 years. When George Ponsonby became leader of the Whigs in the Commons, Tierney often deputised for him, and was seen as being rather more effective in the House, though that wasn't too difficult. And it was for that reason that after Ponsonby's death, Tierney was eventually drafted in to take over the leadership of the opposition in the House. And as a leader, he was active in marshalling his troops to oppose the government and winning occasional victories in the division lobbies. But he was also quite careful to keep his coalition of supporters united by not being excessively confrontational. He's also gone down in parliamentary history for a remark attributed to him about the art of opposition. The job of the opposition, he was quoted as saying, is to oppose everything, propose nothing, and to turn out the government. As a pithy phrase, it's been repeated many times down the years, but it's actually rather a crude and limited description of the job. In fact, he himself was at the forefront of recognising that an opposition also has to present itself as a credible alternative government and to organise itself to campaign for its own policies. In that, he was particularly insightful as a leader, in my view, and perhaps he was ahead of his time. But his time in the job was, however, cut short. At the end of his first year, he fell ill and had to significantly scale back his contributions. He remained nominal leader of the party, but finally stood down at the start of 1821. He remained an MP and briefly took office in government again 6 years later in a Tory-led government before dying suddenly of heart failure at the age of 68. For all his many accomplishments and his place in the dictionary of quotations about opposition, it's probably that infamous duel with the Prime Minister for which he's now best remembered. Had things gone differently that day, his place in history would have had a much more tragic significance. As it is, today's Prime Ministers might reflect that whatever else they have to contend with in political battles, the bullets they have to dodge from the opposition are at least metaphorical ones. So, that's George Tierney, the latest of our leaders of the opposition to not quite become Prime Minister. To read more about him, including those contemporary reports of his duel with Pitt, you can read it all along with the stories of another 43 leaders of the opposition who didn't quite make it to number 10 in the Not Quite Prime Ministers, published by Biteback today. And you can order it directly from the publishers or on Amazon or wherever you get your books from. I'll be back with more videos like this one very soon, so do make sure that you've liked it and subscribe to the channel. Switch on notifications so that you don't miss the rest of the series as well. But until then, thanks for watching, look after yourself, and I'll see you again soon.